The rain was blinding, and the eerie lights in the streets only obscured things further as they created illusions in the night, throwing off what James could see. He tried to make sense of his directions by visuals at first, but the rain was too strong for that now, so he had to drive based on muscle memory. What times did he turn? At what intersection felt like the right one? The storm outside had only gotten worse since the presence of that Nazi, but he had no choice but to brave it. Getting to Elizabeth before she left was crucial. He heard the honking of other cars as he shot past them as fast as he could be allowed. And after finally pulling up to her apartment, he ran to the inside and sprinted up the stairs to contact her. He knocked on the door furiously to let her know he was there, but there was no answer. "Frost! Elizabeth, are you in there?" he called. There was no answer. He pulled out his key to her apartment and opened the door. To his horror, she had already left. Her purse was missing, and her bathroom smelled misty like she'd showered recently. She was getting ready for work, obviously. "Damn that stubborn woman," he hissed. He knew the nightclub she'd likely gone to as well, the Ace of Clubs. It was an out-of-the-way club for both the rich socialites who wanted to hide their illegal bootlegging and drinking, and of course the reprobates who couldn't care less if they were seen, as long as they got sloshed. She worked there for a few years and had paid well at first as a cocktail waitress, going around and serving drinks for the gamblers and audience, and then later as a performer and singer. Needless to say, she drew a large crowd, and that might have been her exact intentions here. A large crowd to further increase the number of babbling mouths who might spill a helpful clue to her. It was a start, if nothing else, so he turned on his heel and marched out of the apartment, locking it behind him and hurrying outside. As he got into his car again, he noticed that right before he fired up his engine, a grayish small car that was parked behind him on the street fired up its own engine. All at once, a cold sweat began to overtake James Troy, a distinct feeling of paranoia. That car felt familiar to him, like it was something he'd seen before but never paid any attention to it, something just out of thought but always present. He could just be imagining it, of course, but years of experience taught him to never ignore a sudden instinctive response like this. "Nothing I can do about it anyway. Let's see if I'm right about you." Troy drove off onto the road and made his way deeper into the city towards the club. He glanced in the rearview window behind him to see, and as he suspected, the car from outside the apartment wasn't far behind him. This should have worried Troy, but it also made him somewhat relieved. If the Nazis were tailing him, they weren't attacking Elizabeth. But he couldn't take the chance of leading these guys off either. If there were more of them, and there were already some making their way to the club, he couldn't afford the luxury of just trying to lose his tail either. You just have to deal with them when you got parked. Every now and then as he drove through the stormy city, he'd take a sudden and sharp turn to try and throw off the tail, but they'd be right behind him in moments. They were hot on his trail, and perhaps it was useless to lose him anyway. They might have known exactly where he was going. This fact crossed Troy's mind, and he quickly sped up to find the club, realizing that this goose chase was ultimately pointless. When the Ace of Clubs was a hideout for bootleggers and alcoholics during the Prohibition, it became very secretive and reclusive. To find it, you had to know exactly what street to be on, and you had to have a special entry ticket. Even knowing the street, however, wasn't enough. The place had no official address. To find it, you first have to drive down a street known as Yankee Lane. There you'd see a large rundown inn with boards blocking up windows and doors to let everyone know the building was off limits. Anyone would just drive right past it. Unless you knew that just to the far left side, there was an alleyway that led to a large pair of double doors that any outsider would think was just a passage to the basement or lower chambers. In truth, this pair of double wooden doors were the secret entrance into the Ace of Clubs. Troy parked his car just on the right side of the inn and climbed out of it. He then slammed his door and turned to see the gray car, which had been on his tail, stop too. He glared at it, making them well aware that he was waiting for them. As if answering his summons, the car turned off and two men climbed out. Both were white. One had blonde hair and the other black. They were both rather large, but one was more well-built and toned, while the other could have been mistaken for a barrel with legs and arms. The blonde, toned one approached and crossed his arms. "You James Troy?" "Boys," James challenged, "you tailed me from my office to Elizabeth's apartment to here. If you didn't know I was James Troy by now, I'd say you're the worst tails in the spy business. You know exactly who the hell I am, so how about telling me what you want?" Seeing that any form of pleasantries were now out the window, the black-haired one pulled out a long chain from the trunk of the car and gripped it firmly in his meat-like hands. The other one approached, placing brass knuckles on his fingers. Their answer didn't need to be verbalized. Troy got the message. "Guys, I think you're making a big mistake," Troy warned. "You should have backed off, Troy," the black-haired one growled. He came fast and fierce. Troy yanked out his handgun but was quickly caught off guard as the blonde man took a swing at him. Troy stumbled back, and then he hit the ground. The gun fell. He scrambled to grab it but was kicked in the stomach for his effort. Troy rolled out of the way and was back on his feet as the black-haired man was swinging his chain at his head. Troy ducked the swing and kicked him back. The blonde one charged, brass knuckles ready to cut flesh off of Troy's face. An inexperienced fighter would have jumped back or ducked, but James had fought guys like this before. His wild swing was open, leaving his chest exposed. James rushed forward and planted his shoulder firmly into the man's ribs while grabbing his wrist. As the blonde punk felt the wind get knocked from his chest, James swiftly grabbed him by the belt of his pants and flipped him to the ground. But no sooner could he celebrate this flip than the black-haired one was swinging his chain at Troy again. Troy raised his arm and caught the blow and winced as the chain struck his exposed forearm. The blonde one, who was also getting back on his feet and was ready to take another swing at James, was already moving in for the kill. Troy realized he was blocked on either side. It was time to get aggressive and use a little misdirection. Troy stepped in like he wanted to punch the black-haired chain man. In response, the black-haired man stepped back defensively, while the blonde-haired man saw his chance and rushed. At that last moment, Troy feinted the punch and swung an outstretched arm backwards, backhanding the blonde one. His blow worked, but the momentum of the blonde-haired thug was not so easily stopped, and he found the fist of the brass knuckles meeting his shoulder. With a grunt, he fell backwards and crashed into the black-haired man, who then wrapped his chain around Troy's neck from behind, intending to squeeze the life out of him. Troy suddenly had a vague memory of Gutierrez, the young man who they'd been looking into in the first place. Is this how he died? The very same way? A chain wrapped around his neck from behind? Troy gagged and placed his fingers inside the chains to fight them off. As he did this, the blonde-haired man, with blood dripping from his nose, was walking over to pound Troy in the mouth. "You're a real son of a bitch," he snarled. "And you're a traitor," James wheezed through the chokehold. "Your people betrayed us," he snarled. "We're the victims. And now we'll kill you. And that bitch inside." Troy struggled against the chain, causing the black-haired man to raise him up further so that he could feel the tip of his nose on the back of his head. Breathing was harder now, and Troy's vision was starting to go dark. The blonde man was pulling back his fist. He swung with all his strength, and Troy took the hit, gagging as he felt pain rip through his cheek and the side of his eye. The blonde man didn't stop and struck again, this time in Troy's stomach. James grunted and felt a rib crack as the pain rocketed up his middle. The blonde man was now swinging more for fun than for effectiveness, and when he threw his third punch, Troy finally yanked his body downward. It hurt his throat to do it, but in doing so, where his head had been was now the confused black-haired traitor who'd been pulling forward by Troy's sudden yank. Teeth flew as the black-haired goon took the hit full on, and he hit the ground in a heap. "Albert!" the blonde one shouted. "You bastard!" With a roar of rage, the blonde one took another swing at Troy, who now was not content to just stand and take it. He dodged and landed a blow of his own. He followed up with a forward kick, which forced the blonde man back. His weight was to his advantage, though, and no sooner had he staggered back than he was coming back again with another blow. James ate the shot and grit his teeth as his chin was now cut open. However, he managed to reach up and grab the blonde man's hair as he yanked him downward, bringing his knee up into the traitor's face. The brawl carried on with both bleeding from the face and mouth. But Troy could feel something awful in his stomach. The brass knuckles had taken their toll on him, and he had to do something fast, or risk taking a hit he couldn't get up from. Just as he was about to catch his breath, the blonde fighter was getting ready for another fierce strike. Lightning struck overhead from the storm, and Troy threw his body away from the swing, rolling on the wet pavement. He scrambled back to his feet as the slick ground was harder to stand on. The sidewalk was just as dangerous. The black-haired fellow was still out cold on the grass next to the inn garden, and the blonde one was running after Troy. James waited patiently, and just as the brass knuckles came flying angrily for his face, Troy pivoted and stepped to the side of the strike, just as he placed his fist squarely in the blonde man's abdominals. The thug shouted, but Troy wasn't waiting for him to get back into the fight before he swept the legs out from under him and brought him to the ground. Troy straddled and mounted him and began punching as fiercely and angry as he could, aiming to draw blood. The thug swung back, catching Troy a few times, and the two began grappling on the ground, trying to overcome the other in a wild and fierce match of wits, holds, and random blows. But, for once, Troy had a clear advantage. While the blonde thug had those brass knuckles in a standing fight, they prevented him from getting a solid grip with his fingers, so he couldn't grip anything as well as Troy could. Soon Troy had him in a leg lock that would surely break the fool's leg if enough force was applied. "Damn you! Start talking, you son of a bitch," Troy demanded. "Who are you, and what do you want? Are you with the Nazis? Where are the bombs?" "I'm not telling you shit, American pig," the blonde one snarled. "You're dead. All of you are dead. Judging by your accent, I'd say you're just as American as I am." There was no answer. Troy waited. Suddenly, Troy heard a crack and a sizzling noise. It had nothing to do with the leg hold. He let go and looked to see that the blonde man's mouth was beginning to foam. He'd bitten something. Something definitely not good. Hey, spit it out!" Troy shouted, running him and grabbing his collar. "Spit it out right now!" As he finished saying the Fuhrer's name, his voice trailed off, and his eyes glazed over as the cyanide pills did their work fast and effectively. "Damn it!" James hissed. He turned his attention to the black-haired one and saw that he was still unmoving. James got up and ran to him through broken ribs and grabbed his huge meaty arms and swung them behind his back to handcuff him, just like he used to do with the police force. "All right, big guy, your blonde friend just bit it," he snapped. "I have no interest in seeing you die too, so you answer my questions quick and I'll... He stopped as he saw there were now 3 teeth missing from his mouth, and there was froth coming from his lips. The earlier strike must have broken the cyanide tablet in his teeth, and it killed him. 2 men who could have answered so many questions, now gone. Troy rolled off the fat tub of lard and groaned as he caught his breath, nursing his throbbing face and stomach. They hadn't been the best fighters he'd ever tussled with, but damn if they didn't make him hurt. "I really need to take some boxing classes or something," he grunted. Then thought better of it. A waste of money. He was more used to fighting by experience anyway. Maybe Elizabeth should, though. She could... No! "Elizabeth!" he shouted, staggering to his feet and running down the alley to get to her. Those 2 asses had kept him too long. "Don't be hurt, damn it! Don't you dare be hurt! Hang on, Frost!"